Welcome to the course Introduction to Urban Planning. In this session today, in our effort to contextualize our cities and to review their emplotment and to see how did we reach here where we see such giant cities, we will walk through the period of modernization till 1979. Starting with mid-century modern 1940 to 1979. This period starts with World War II, 1939 to 1945, as you had seen all the cities rising to power from different geographies. There were social tensions and there were differences in ideology. Aircraft played a major role in the conflict. We see use of nuclear weapon in the war. Tens of millions of people died due to genocide, including the Holocaust, starvation, massacres, and disease. At this period, our struggle as a nation for freedom was at peak. We follow Professor Lugar's lectures and align with the Indian context in this session. Our coverage for today's session will include, we'll look at the futuristic planning, how we were looking after World War II. Then we'll look at how we were rebuilding because of the destruction which we had, and also post-independence or during that time, how did we really as a country started from scratch. Further, we'll look at the planning conversations in the period with respect to planning approaches, issues in planning, and the relevant social context at that time. We'll also look at new technologies such as car, air conditioning, and computers, and what kind of changes did they bring into the planning of cities and in cities as such. We'll look at the narratives of the failures, like we'll look at the urban decline, what was happening at this time. Further, we'll end at the neoliberal period. So accordingly, the learning outcomes expected from you would be that after completion of this session, you should be able to decipher the concept of futuristic planning. You should be able to review the rebuilding, the destruction, starting from the how did we really start from scratch to the past and till today's context. You should be able to discuss the planning conversations of the period, various planning approaches, what were the issues with approaches we adopted, along with the social context with which we were dealing with at that time. Further, you should be able to review what kind of implications the new technology and innovation had on our cities and on us. So we'll look at how did coming of cars, air conditioning, and computers changed our environment, and then the way we lived in the cities. Further, you should be able to review the cases of failure and success with their context and aligned factors. Lastly, we will touch upon the neoliberal period, what was starting, where did we reach, and what was happening at that time. In the mid-century modern period from 1940 to 1979, planning was central to many interventions in cities. Decolonization was happening. In this period, we note people's movements. We see many ideas came, and some being very strong ideas taking brutal form. We also see changes in the industrial cities. We also see how with the invention of car, aircraft, air conditioners, and computers, city characteristics were transforming. Planners reacted and responded to the context, they responded to the pattern and the approaches, and we see new planning theories coming in this time. Following the war, we see that the cities were rebuilding and were modernizing and transforming both physically and socially. In the image, we see Tokyo, which was built again and was built better. This period was complete destruction led through industrialization and competition, which we were seeing. There was social divide. The present was dreadful and painful for the mass, and the past which led them to this present was no longer fancied by the people. Therefore, people started to look at the future. Futuristic became the new theme. This theme was in the movies, in writings, and also in the planning of cities. There was a lot of physical and social rebuilding. Some of the destruction took place through planning intervention itself in form of urban renewal programs. These urban renewal programs targeted the social cleansing, like removing the certain group of people from certain area. The prominent idea in the period was to start again. You see in the pictures urban renewal projects in American cities. We also see Abercrombie's plan of 1944, where he visualized how London should be as it rebuilds itself. Abercrombie's suggestion included build polycentric rather than dense center and creating activity clusters and nodes in different areas radiating outside. The concept of green belt around London also evolved, and outside the green belt, the new modern towns would exist and would be connected with the central London. We also see Milton Keynes, closer to London, built from 1940 onwards. It was built on the modernistic lines for the cars and had utilitarian areas. It had grid pattern, it had zoning. Further, it was built on the lines of Le Corbusier principles. Modernism was also applied to the planning of the inner city. In the image, we can see how the same ideas were applied to rebuild the inner city with fast and economical development, like looking for the low-cost construction. Modernism was also applied to the planning in other countries like Singapore, modernist housing state, housing development, and Soviet Union era housing in Moscow. We also see mass housing in Brazil, modernistic capital. In India, the concept was radicalized by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. The problem with modern approach was that the development taken in period did not acknowledge the race and the class, and therefore all interventions became very racialized. Most of the new development were areas of poverty and contained people of color. These new developments became the places where high poverty and with minorities in places, and these were called as urban blight. And these places became site for urban renewal, another way to cleanse the city and the communities. Many of these urban renewal replaced the historic and vibrant places also. This is referred as the destruction through planning intervention by Professor Lugar. Purit Aigo in St. Louis is an example of failure of modernistic projects, where they failed to address the community aspect. These buildings were the example of poverty, crime, poor design, non-functional facilities which had to be pulled down later. We see that in India, we created Bombay City Improvement Trust on December 9, 1898 in response to the Mumbai plague epidemic of 1896, which we'll also see in our health series in our lecture. The City Improvement Trust, CIT, undertook a host of measures to improve sanitary and living conditions in the city. The planned opening up of suburb was due to the trust, the work which the trust took up. During the visit of Sir Patrick Geddes' visit in India from 1914 to 24, he suggested the need for town planning legislation as well as preparation of comprehensive plan for cities. We see formulation of the Bombay Town Planning Act in 1915, we see Uttar Pradesh Town Planning Act in 1919, we see Madras Town Planning Act in 1920. So we see further other acts coming up in different parts of the country. We further see that New Delhi, the capital of Britain, India, was the last addition to the formally built cities of Delhi. It was built after 1911 AD by the British as a symbol of their political power and dominance over the Indian subcontinent. Planned by two leading 20th century British architects, Sir Edwin Lutyens and Sir Herbert Baker. We had initiated strategic and futuristic planning in India even before independence through setting up of the National Planning Committee by Indian National Congress in 1938, the Bombay Plan and the Gandhian Plan in 1944, People's Plan in 1945 by Post-War Reconstruction Committee of Indian Trade Union. We see Sarvodaya Plan in 1950 by Jayaprakash Narayan were the steps in this direction of making strategic and futuristic planning. Our planned economic development began in 1951 with the inception of first 5-year plan. We also see development of understanding of environmental hygiene and post created for them through Boer Committee in 1946. Post-independent towns, Chandigarh, Bhubaneswar and Gandhinagar are few of the towns developed after independence. They were planned keeping in mind the modern planning concepts which we have been seeing. The first major concern was to answer the problems that arise out of refugee rehabilitation after the partition in 1947. This resulted in creation of planned towns. Faridabad, Nilokheri and Rajpura are few examples. In the beginning of all these new towns had high proportion of residential components. The other components like schools, hospitals were developed gradually. Later on, a comprehensive master plan were prepared for these towns. Post-independence, many cities were built along the lines of modernism. As we see in modern movement town planning of Bhubaneswar in 1948, the vision and the plan of Bhubaneswar was created by Otto Koenigsberger. He was appointed as Director of Housing. He was in charge of new town development across India, including organization of Chandigarh Commission. We also see post-independence and partition, we had pressure to house refugee. We see the creative phase of Faridabad as an industrial hub from 1949 to 2000 built on the cooperative pattern. The partition in 1947 brought surge of refugees into Delhi who were housed in temporary refugee camps. Even till 1949, not much could be done for permanent rehabilitation of these refugees. The immediate problem of shelter and food for such a large number was so overwhelming that the official machinery was fighting a day-to-day battle of survival. We see key women leader Kamla Devi back from the Purana Killa refugee camp. Kamla Devi met Dr. Rajendra Prasad with a plan to house 30,000 refugees, wherein the refugees could contribute their labor to build a township, complete with housing, infrastructure and small industrial units on the cooperative pattern. Refugees were rehabilitated by Jawaharlal Nehru as part of the Pakistan Refugee Resettlement Project following partition in 1947, also in an attempt to declog Delhi. Many central government offices were consciously moved to Faridabad city. This township was built up by the displaced persons themselves under the guidance of Sudhir Ghosh and some other officers. What was previously just a wasteland was converted into a thriving colony. This was also a big and unique human experiment to resettle people. Industrial Revolution in Faridabad in 1949, the government of East Punjab visualized to make Faridabad a center of industrial activity. It was planned to have engineering workshops, precision tools manufacturing units, oil mills, ice plants, leather goods and so on, so that it will absorb large number of unskilled laborers. Consequently, new industrial town was founded in 1949. In 1950, 3 factory sites were allotted, 15 acres of land to Bata shoe manufacturers, 10 acres to Janki Das and Corporation, which was dealing with bicycle manufacturers, and 10 acres to Upper India Metal Work Engineering Works. Further, we see Le Corbusier's produced the plan for Chandigarh in India. Planning of Chandigarh was finalized by Le Corbusier in 1951. The city was built on the system of boulevards that adhered to Le Corbusier's theory of the 7 V's. The Chandigarh city plan was determined by the relationships between the automobile and pedestrians, point of origin and destination, as it was by the city's political purpose. As per the vision of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, Chandigarh was a new city of free India, totally fresh and wholly responsive to the aspirations of the future generations of this great country, and that the city shall be free from all shackles and shall be unfettered by the tradition of the past. The city shall be so built and nurtured that it shall be a model for a glorious future growth of the country. So we see how we were moving forward or looking towards the futuristic planning in our cities. We further see as a nation in the second 5-year plan in 1956-61, we made provision for preparation of plans of large cities, organizing planning activities. We also saw provision for regional plan for industrial and river valley projects. Further, we see a new capital city of Gandhinagar was planned by H.K. Mewara and P.M. Apte. On the similar principles, it was built in 1960 as the capital of Gujarat state in western India with a spacious modern character. Gandhinagar was one of the 3 capital cities built in post-independent India. There was a determination to make Gandhinagar a purely Indian enterprise, partly because the state of Gujarat was the birthplace of Mahatma Gandhi. Further, in early 1970s, we see planning of Navi Mumbai, a satellite city of Mumbai metropolis, a planned development with sustainable infrastructure. Navi Mumbai project, one of the world's largest new town project, was taken up and conceived in early 1970s. The planning of Navi Mumbai began in 1971 and involved leading architects and urban planners like Charles Correa. As a chief architect, we see Sirish Patel, Praveena Mehta and R.K. Jha as a chief planner. The site that was finally chosen was across the harbour from the Bombay Island. There were 2 key aspects to be dealt with, that creating living spaces and setting up mass transport systems. So you can see how we were emphasizing on the mass transport system as well at this time. Further, we look at the other aspects which were at the back of this entire idea was decongestion, decentralization. Further, the concept was to design polycentric development model in contrast to the monocentric model. Furthermore, a balanced land distribution was planned, and importantly, 12 self-contained nodal townships were designed along the mass rapid transport corridors, which would minimize travel time and distance between nodes and the neighboring cities. We also see development of financial hubs like Bandra Kurla complex in 1977. The MMRDA was appointed as the spatial planning authority for the planning and development of this complex. It would cover 370 hectares area of the area which was once lying land on either side of Meethi River, Wakola Nala and Mahim Creek. The area had poor surface drainage and was severely affected by pollution in the Mahim Creek. Further, we see as the environmental consciousness was gaining momentum, we see that we started working towards the environmental protection, and we see the Environmental Protection Act came in 1986. EIA was introduced first in 1976 to 77 when the Planning Commission asked then the Department of Science and Technology to examine the River Valley project from the environmental angle. This was subsequently extended to cover those projects which required approval of the Public Investment Board. These were administrative decisions, the Government of India enacted the Environmental Protection Act on 23rd May 1986. Mrs. Indira Gandhi had articulately outlined the hopes and fears of the developing countries in response to then prevailing understanding of environmental priorities. She presented a sharply defined perception of environmental concerns and their relationship to the imperatives of economic growth and development. Issues that were brought to stem largely from the industrial development were put into a more realistic framework so that the basic causes of environmental degradation in the poor and underdeveloped countries could be identified and tackled. Mrs. Gandhi, speaking before a gathering of distinguished Indian scientists on 3rd January 1981, had proclaimed development with conservation means that growth priorities do not sacrifice the need of tomorrow. Development with conservation means that growth priorities do not sacrifice the needs of tomorrow for immediate compulsions. Poverty and economic backwardness are themselves the biggest constraints to growth. Further, we find urban agencies coming in. We see the creation of agency of urban interventions such as Urban Development Authority in 1985. We see municipal corporation and municipalities coming later on. We see in this time Town and Country Planning Organization came up in 1962. State Industrial Development Investment Corporation. Further, we see Housing and Urban Development Corporation Limited HUDCO, which came up in 1977. Creation of the separate Ministry of Urban Development in 1985 in the Government of India for the first time in the history of Indian democracy marked a new era of special attention of urbanization and related issue at the national level. This was a result of global emphasis on local factors such as rapid pace of urbanization during 1971 and 81 and emerging public attention covering various schemes and initiatives such as Rural-Urban Relationship Committee in 1963, Urban Land Clearing and Regulation Act of 1977, creation of HUDCO in 1977, various Government of India programs. Another milestone for Turning Point in 1985 was setting up of a National Commission on Urbanization (NCU) to have overall assessment of urban issues and potential strategies and creation of National Housing Bank to accelerate supply of housing. We further see UDP-FI guidelines were prepared in 1996 in consonance with the provision of 74th Constitutional Amendment Act. Town and Country Planning Act came in 1947. We further see the Model Town and Regional Planning and Development Law came in 1962. Now, looking at the planning conversations of the time, this was also the time of change in planning theories. From the applied theory, which resulted in the built form, to the situationist international SI, which is also called SI, there were reactions to the top-down approach of planning. The key people were Jane Jacob, Kevin Lynch, Harvey Milk, Sherry Ann Stan, Dolores Hayden. Sherry Ann Stan, writing in 1969 about citizen involvement in planning process in United States, described a ladder of citizen participation that showed participation ranging from high to low. The ladder is a guide to seeing who has power when important decisions are being made. Jane Jacob was an American-Canadian journalist, author, theorist, and activist who influenced urban studies, sociology, and economics. Her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, published in 1961, argued that urban renewal and slum clearance did not respect the need of the city dwellers. Jacobs organized grassroots efforts to protect neighborhoods from urban renewal and slum clearance, in particular plans by Robert Moses to overhaul her own Greenwich Village neighborhood. She was instrumental in the eventual cancellation of the Lower Manhattan Expressway. We further see Kevin Lynch, who was an American urban planner and author. He brought new way to visualize and experience cities based on perception of urban environment and was an early proponent of mental mapping. So far you have been seeing all the planning we have been doing. It has been very rigid, grid iron pattern and all with the dimension, but this was a different way which Kevin Lynch brought to perceive and experience the cities. With the urban decline, we see the concept of broken window also gained momentum, though it was challenged later. We also see, aligning with this, the concept of Jane Jacobs' eyes on the streets. We also see the concept of the broken windows theory, first studied by Philip Gimbrado and introduced by George Kelling and James Wilson. This theory holds that the visible indicators of disorder, such as vandalism, loitering, and broken windows, invite criminal activity and should be prosecuted as a result. This form of policing has been tested in several real-world settings. Although initial research proved to be promising, this theory has been met with several criticisms, especially many scholars pointing to the fact that there is no clear causal relationship between lack of order and crime. Rather, crime going down when orders go up is merely a coincidental correlation. Additionally, this theory has opened the doors for racial and class bias, especially in form of stop and frisk. Another important idea we see of the time is Situationist International, SI. The idea was the world we live in is governed by unexamined and unrecognized cultural forces, which can only be undone through engineering radically different situations from which to reflect. This was the key concept behind the Situationist International, a group of left-wing artists and activists whose practices were designed to unsettle and disrupt the system of consumerist homogeneity in late 20th century in the Western society. Activities like walking the city aimlessly were reimagined as the statement against a society that demanded production, and maps were cut up and reassembled to facilitate wandering. Perhaps unusually for a small group of political artists, these ideas corresponded to real and widespread political and social action. Most notably inspiring the 1968 protest and rioting in Paris, in which situationist graphics and slogans featured prominently. Architecture and human geography were key influences on the movement and the art that came out of it, with maps in particular offering an opportunity to subvert the way people think about the spaces they move through. By positioning maps as a socially agreed and therefore rarely unbiased representation of environment, the situationist practice of cutting them up, ignoring or purposefully misreading them, robbed them of their power to govern the way we negotiate the city. On the other hand, we see use of computers in planning, use of engineering, economic and statistics. We see use of automatic traffic systems, data-driven city management and urban modeling, which we further extended or we see now in the smart city concept. In this period, we see that we started approaching the problem with the positivism and we started applying systems theory. This was the period 1950 to 1960. We also see beginning of urban design and its first program starting at Howard University. Berkeley School of Planning was also very influential in the period to where identified that process was separate from the plan itself. It also emphasized that the Berkeley School also emphasized the understanding that the end target, the outcome of the planning process was always moving as opposed to the rigid ideas of then planners and architects such as Moses, Le Corbusier and F.L. Wright. Also, the school highlighted the pluralistic planning, understanding that everyone's requirement is different and that's the process which has to be followed. We see that America at that time was building millions of dream houses in neighborhood that sustained Victorian stereotype of home as the place of women and the city as the place of men. Urban historian and architect Dolores Hayden tallies the personal and social cost of an American architecture of gender for the two earner family. The single parent family and the single people, many societies have struggled with the architectural and urban consequences of women's paid employment. We further see Harvey Milk. The counterculture of 1960 was an anti-establishment cultural phenomenon that developed throughout much of the Western world between mid-1960 and mid-1970. Milk served almost 11 months in the office, during which he sponsored a bill banning discrimination in public accommodation, housing, and employment on the basis of sexual orientation. Despite his short career in politics, Milk became an icon in San Francisco and a martyr in the gay community. Further, we see another concept coming in by Henry Lefebvre, right to city. The right to city is an idea and slogan first proposed by Henry Lefebvre in his 1968 book, Le Detroit à la Ville. As explained by David Harvey, the right to city is far more than the individual's liberty to access urban resources. It is a right to change ourselves by changing the city. It is, moreover, a common rather than an individual right, since this transformation inevitably depends upon the exercise of a collective power to reshape the process of urbanization. The freedom to make and remake our cities and ourselves is, I want to argue, one of the freedom to make and remake our cities and ourselves was argued as one of the most precious yet most neglected to the human rights. Further, Henry Lefebvre made an attempt to define a new science with practical consequences that would enable to gain a new form of knowledge, which he titled the rhythm analysis. It is a theory which emphasizes a comprehensive perception of various aspects that shape the everyday experience of a man in modern city, as well as conceptual method of multimodal and metamorphical listening. The rhythm analysis involves cyclic, cosmic, and linear mechanical rhythms which are based on the spatio-temporal principles and the expenditure of energy within the subject. The listening experience is then placed into the broader context of biologic, social, and environmental condition. Further, we also see some new ideas coming in, or different ideas coming in. We see that kibbutz, hippie commune had its own settlements. We also see a different kind of settlement coming in Burning Man. We also see different kind of concept coming in Ranjanapura. Further, we see another school of thought coming in Jonestown, French Guiana. Although not all of these really ended well, but these were the concepts which people brought out in different ways. Now, moving forward, we further see that air conditioning again changed the cities. Now, the cities were formulated in the warmer places too. We start seeing urban decline. We also see less immigration to cities, and cities taking the shape of donut, where whites would buy houses in the suburb and the center part was occupied less by the white community. With the advent of highways, it improved the mobility but divided the neighborhood. Interstate highways created more traffic and led to large carbon emission. Highway gave way to suburb living, and the levee towns grew popular in 1957, with the state also providing subsidies. So we see increase in kind of levee towns which were there with the government support also. However, this was not open for all. It was only for the only for the white people. With the highway, people left the cities and also the business left the cities. So we are seeing the kind of decline which is happening. We see that in 1940, 1950, we see mass suburbanization, and the suburbs were planned around the cars. We see business also move to the outskirts, to the mall, which were completely air conditioned and surrounded by cars. We further see loss of manufacturing jobs. There was decline in the industrial cities in 1960. One of the very well-known example is Detroit, which had 20 lakh population in 1950, which reduced to 70,000 in 2010. We also see the concept of airport city. In Atlanta, we also see Sun City in Sunbelt Atlanta, which is considered as world's busiest city in the time. In 1968, we see riots because of the structural racism declining in the urban economy, feeling alienation. We also see the assassination of Martin Luther and John Kennedy in this time. So there was riot, and then the urban decline was happening. There was a social unrest. We further see that car industry was trying hard to destroy the public transport system. In 1979, we see urban decline. The urbanization, which was rapid, we see disinvestment started. Urban renewal was segregating the community, creating social tension and political tension. We see Lafayette right to city movement here. From here, we see the beginning of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, which is a policy model of social studies and economics that transfer control of economic factors to private sectors from the public sector. So you saw how our cities grew and then they started declining, and then we are coming on the verge of neoliberalism. So we'll stop here today. Summarizing what we saw today, we deciphered the concept of futuristic planning. We looked at the rebuilding of how after the World War and after the independence, we were rebuilding at the global level as well as at the Indian context. We further discussed the planning conversation of the period, planning approach, issues in planning along with their social context. We further reviewed the new technology, car, air conditioning, and computers and their impact on the city characteristics. We also reviewed the cases of failure and success with the context and aligned factors, and then we have stopped at the birth of neoliberal period. These are the references and further suggested reading. Our coverage was limited with the scope to make you aware of the topic. There are enormous readings and movies available to explore. Few are suggested here. This is not an extensive list. You may feel free to suggest more from your experience. Please feel free to ask questions. Let us know about your concerns you have. Do share your opinion, experiences, and suggestions. Looking forward to interacting and co-learning with you while exploring cities and urban planning. That's all for today. Thank you.